Windhorse is our innate ability to uplift ourselves and our environment by giving rise to a positive energy that is both relaxed and disciplined. Since 1981, Windhorse Community Services has integrated this understanding with modern conventional therapies, meditation, and contemplative traditions in the development of at-home, whole-person mental health recovery. Windhorse Journal is dedicated to the mission of communicating decades of clinical and personal experience to professionals, educators, students, and anyone seeking recovery options. Please join the dialogue.
Welcome to Windhorse Journal Entry 77. Could I be a voice for those still suffering? In part 3 of this 5-part series, we again join the members of Julia's long-standing Windhorse team, Janneli Chapin, Jack Gipple, and Chuck Knapp, as they discuss the 12 years of their working together along with her psychiatrist, Dr. Green. The team reminisces on the before and after of Julia's time at Windhorse and the strength she found to harness a renewed outlook on life. We hope you enjoy.
Welcome everyone to the Windhorse Journal. I'm your host, Chuck Knapp, and I'm so pleased and honored to be presenting today's podcast, a conversation with a former team about the completely remarkable recovery journey they shared. We're joined today by our dear friend and former client, Julia, and by Janneli Chapin and Jack Gipple, who were her primary team members. So, Julia, your book, which I can't recommend highly enough for people who are interested in your path, but also specifically to learn more about the depth and complexity of cutting as a practice. Your book was reviewed by a colleague of Dr. Green's, and he pointed out how completely remarkable your journey was and made a number of points that I'd like to ask about. The first is he spoke about your emerging sense of personhood and power that you described gradually developing. And I'm curious how you experienced that, and what do you recall about your emerging confidence and urges toward health?
I think that my divorce was the beginning of that. That was a very messy divorce. It was very hard to go through, but I think Jack mentioned maybe the last time we spoke about how I was able to start really focusing how angry I was at the fact that he was having an affair that I didn't know about, and how I mean, I was in terrible shape. You know, things were really awful, and he chose to have an affair. And I mean, I think he really tried for a while. I was not easy to live with, but nevertheless, he left, and I was left. Before Jack and Janneli came, I was totally alone with my dogs. And I think that what you said, Jack, was true. I think that I wouldn't have survived. If my dogs weren't there, I don't think I would have gotten through. I had this incredible commitment to Chloe and Shannon, to taking care of them, to just taking care of them. I felt very responsible for them. I remember my children, I was glad that they weren't living with me because I could not take care of them. And I certainly did not want them feeling like they had to take care of me. They had witnessed a lot of very terrible things, and I didn't want them to experience any other terrible things. They were kids. But I was alone and I couldn't take care of myself. I didn't know what to do. And I lived for my dogs, you know, taking care of them. And they kept me alive. They really did. I remember he was still living at home, and somebody said to me, you're actually washing his clothes, and he's sleeping with some woman, and you're washing his clothes. He was living in the basement. And I said, wow, that's crazy. I'm washing this guy's clothes and he's sleeping with another woman. And that was the point where I told him he had to move out.
That's an island of clarity right there.
That was
where you went boing. am I doing?
Exactly. It never occurred to me. It's like, wow, that is so true. How can I be doing that? And that was when I said, you have to leave, even though I didn't know what I was going to do when he left. But he did. He moved out, and I was alone, and I couldn't do anything. I was totally helpless. I didn't know how to write a check to pay for bills. And so my sister hired someone to come in and pay all my bills and to write checks and to do all of that, because I didn't know how to. I didn't know how to do anything. And it was an incredibly painful time. I realized I was basically like an infant. But then Jack and Janneli came along, and I started focusing that anger. And Jack and Janneli started teaching me things. Like I was learning how to cook. They would come and cook with me, and then come over, Thanksgiving. They would teach me how to make Thanksgiving, cook a turkey, and then they would come for dinner. I remember Ian and your girls, would be crawling all over the floor. They were all babies. And you would all help me cook Thanksgiving dinner and then come over and share it with me. Jack taught me how to make a pinhole camera. Just taught me how to do things that I just didn't know how to do. Going through the divorce, they both came with me to the divorce lawyer, because I didn't even know what to say to him. And they would take notes and help me know what to do. And I remember going to court. I think you came with me, Jack, and I fell trying to go up to the, talk with the judge. And, I was just, it was just an incredibly painful time, but I had people to share it with me and to help me get through it. And then eventually I started to go to a school that was nearby and volunteer teaching kids who were Spanish speaking. And I volunteered this wonderful teacher, who really was so generous. And I was there every single day, no matter what the weather was like. And that really helped me a lot. And then eventually, I remember Jack teaching me how to drive. Eventually, I learned how to live and do things. I remember you letting me drive your car, and even then, no matter how fuzzy my own head was, I was amazed that you actually trusted me enough to learn in your car, even though we were in a massive parking lot with nothing in the parking lot. So I don't think I could have hit anything if I tried, but I was so amazed and grateful that you let me do that. It just made me feel like you had some confidence in me, which I didn't have. And I learned to drive, which was one thing I never thought I would be able to do ever again. So all of these things started to get me back into life, to make me feel like I could live again. I would go to meetings with Janneli. There was some kind of meetings that we would go to with a recycling. There was some kind of a recycling group that you were part of. And that's when I met different people from Windhorse that were involved in that. It was in the evening, and you go to that with you and met different people.
The green truck, wasn't it called? Something like that?
The green truck.
Right.
That's right, the green truck. And I just learned to speak with people and meet people and learn about getting back into being human being again. And it was a slow process. And I started to feel more confident in myself that I could do things.
The way you frame it is like I knew what was going on, which isn't accurate from where I sat. But I think I was responding to some some intelligence that you had that you weren't really connected to, but I don't know, maybe the two of us, when we'd be together, would kind of stumble in the right direction and have kind of confidence that we could kind of work it out together. But I would have to say it was very much a mutual stumbling in the right direction. I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, I think the things were that they were just normal kinds of living activities that, we did. We went shopping, and just did normal kinds of things, but things that were not normal for me, things that I hadn't done. The other thing that I think was major was that I started to lose weight. And losing weight, going from 200 something pounds where I couldn't walk on the sidewalk, and starting to lose weight, that was a huge, in so many ways. I was able to get around better, but also mentally, that was huge.
And you lost that really fast. Do you remember that? You changed medications and almost stopped eating and were walking
I
everywhere.
stopped eating.
And you walked everywhere in town. You walked,
I walked everywhere and I stopped eating. Yeah, I mean, I didn't do it probably in the best way, but it became an obsession. I remember every morning I would leave a message for Dr. Green. I would leave him a message on his answering machine and tell him how much weight I had lost from the day before. And it was like an ounce or 2 ounces. And I would leave him a message every day about how much I had lost. And I would eat Cheerios. I lived on Cheerios. And I don't think he or anyone realized that I stopped eating. My sister wanted me to go back to that diet place that I had gone to, but I didn't want to go back because at that point I was already on this, not eating roll. And I knew that I couldn't continue to do that if I went back there. So I didn't go back.
That's right. You went to that inpatient program. And then when you came back, you were like on a mission. You were like kind of born again. You had a plan, and you had a little card at a restaurant. If you ordered something, you'd have
no
that.
salt, no sugar, no.
Oh, yeah. Right.
I still have that.
In the review by that psychiatrist, he noted the tremendous power you had, almost a mantra, that the urges toward life were stronger than the undertow toward death. And he questioned what your family lineage was around possibly Holocaust survivors and different people that had experienced multiple layers of trauma, but as a cultural thing for Jews, that's something that you lived with for generations, maybe thousands of years. And I don't know, he was just throwing that question out. And does that resonate with you?
I remember thinking about that when I read that. I did lose one family member in the Holocaust, and my parents came over from Poland before the war, except one aunt, my father's sister. One of them didn't want to leave Poland for some reason, and she was killed in a concentration camp. But my parents would never talk about Poland. They would never talk about anything that happened, what life was like for them in Poland. They would never talk about anything to me.
That's so natural. That generation, didn't talk about their experiences or their memories a lot. The intergenerational trauma is just so intense.
There's also an immigrant experience because in my family that came over from, part of it from Norway and Sweden, they didn't talk about it. They wanted, my mother was told no, you're going to be an American. We're not teaching you the old language or the old ways. And
Yeah.
there was a kind
Right.
of immigrant severing from the past.
Yeah. The acculturation, it's so intense, or assimilation and
Yeah.
trying to just fit in. And there's some kind of oppression that's going on there too, I feel for immigrants, and yeah, just how painful that is.
Lena,
After my mother died, my sisters and I were going through the things in her apartment, and I never knew anything about my mother's education or
Mm.
what it was like for her. I know that she came here when she was about 20 years old. That much I knew. I never knew if she had any education in Poland. I knew that she spoke English very well. I knew that she could read and write English, but I never knew how she learned
Mm.
that.
Mm.
But after her death, going through her belongings, she had a rolled up diploma, this big diploma that was from elementary school. And she had gone back to elementary school when she was over 21 after she came here, and went back to elementary school at night.
Hmm.
And she graduated from elementary school. And she had this diploma from night school, elementary school. And I framed it. I have it hanging in my house. And it was such an amazing thing to me that she had the courage to go back to elementary school.
Mhm.
She was a grown woman to learn how to read and write.
Wow.
And she did. She
Mhm.
did that.
Wow.
Education was always the most important thing that she, kind of pushed on me and my sister.
that is really an amazing story for an adult to do that, the kind of courage it takes to do that. And, there may not be something that you're consciously aware of as far as your lineage of family and the cultural Jewish lineage, but you obviously have an awful lot of resilience in your warp and weave. And I know we've all experienced that. We're talking about that. And in terms of where spirituality might fit in, another piece of that is, I think, your wish that this process we're in now be helpful, that your voice might be helpful to other people. And that's a tremendous type of a spiritual value and a spiritual offering. Julia, what I'm hearing you describe was you'd had a life. You'd have kids and you lived in different places and you had a full life. And that dissolved in a certain way. And then you were just describing putting this whole thing back together. And, Jack, you spoke some to engaging that process with Julia. And I'm just wondering, Janneli and Jack both, how was it to be experiencing Julia's emergence into this and strength and choices that were being made that went toward health as opposed to sitting back? Like, for instance, telling your ex-husband to move out as opposed to shrinking back from that.
My memory, from my reference point, I never knew you, of course, till I met you. And I knew you for some time, I want to say a month or two, or even before, like the person I know now emerged or started to emerge. That when I first met you, you were pretty flat to me. I don't remember having a dimension of who you were. And then slowly being amazed at hearing the stories of like, oh man, you were a nurse. And like, oh, and because it's not like I mean, the Windhorse method, especially back then, wasn't like I, sat down and got a full like psychosocial history of you. It was kind of like, well, just get to know each other. So we didn't have, I don't remember any giant background, but even if I did get that, it wasn't personal. So that slowly came out. Part of your recovery that I always remember is right in this period, you'd lost a bunch of weight. And then you had a friend, we got you a bike, and I think I tried to teach you how to ride a bike, but it didn't work or it couldn't. But you had this friend who was very long, kind of very devoted to you. And he taught you how to ride a bike. And I've always thought that it was kind of like the genie went back in the bottle. It was almost like your mind at that point, like using diagnostic languages, you would kind of fall into like borderline qualities, like really your mind was in the whole space around you, I think. And so you really dominated a space when you were there. And then when you started to ride a bike, I swear it's like you came into your body and you weren't just in the vicinity of your body, you actually were in your body and you could balance and you could ride a bike. And my experience of you was that you kind of came into your body at that point and synchronized in a way that you were not at all synchronized before. And then I felt like you didn't have that kind of borderline trait, the way you impacted a room no longer had that quality to it. But I remember reflecting that to you and you said, no, you felt just the same as ever. But the difference from the outside was you were having that experience inside your body. And before that, I swear it was projected out into your environment in this really strong kind of emotional field around you. But that was my experience. I remember reflecting that to you, like I said, and you like, it was all the same to you. Like it was all chaos and difficult, whether it was outside of you or inside of you. But honestly, being on the outside, it was a significant difference. And I've always thought that it coincided with you starting to ride a bike.
I'm still good friends with him.
Yep. Yep.
Curious, Jack, you're using this word borderline. Are you using it in terms of boundary or in terms of pathology? I'm not quite sure what you're using that word
Right.
for.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Like I've heard like the experience of being around someone with that kind of a boundary of to themselves. It's often called, described as borderline, is that the person fills the room in a certain way. Like my experience of it is I'm inside of their mind and their emotions. And I question my own mind and my own sanity a great deal. To me, it's a kinesthetic kind of a experience of being surrounded by. And then, so maybe it is a kind of a boundary statement. And then when it all went back inside of you, it was more like, well, that was there and I was here. I was no longer. So that's how I mean to use that term.
Yeah. It sounds like the boundary was much more fluid and then it became somehow more clear or something. Thank you. I wasn't quite sure what you were meaning, so
Sure,
I wanted to understand.
It's an interesting phase, though, to appreciate that, Janneli, clarifying and coming into one's body and synchronizing with one's body more is for many people a very powerful step in being able to kind of focus one's intention, one's life, health coming into decision and disciplines in a different way. And so I'm not surprised that came up in the process of talking about emerging sense of power.
Yeah, we start to know where our boundaries are, where we kind of begin and connect up against another person. And so that's how I was thinking you were talking about it. And I got really curious about that.
Thinking about that terminology, for me, I think I had no boundaries in a sense that everything would just come into me. I had no ability to filter anything out. I had no boundaries for myself. I couldn't stop obsessions from just coming in from everywhere. I had no kind of outer boundaries. Everything would just go in from the environment and I couldn't protect myself from anything. And later on, the bike gave me some sense of being able to control things in some way. So that gave me a boundary. It also learning how to live in the world a little bit, learning how to cook, learning how to write a check, learning how to drive. Even though they were not well developed, they were getting me back to a life that I had had before that I never thought I would ever get back to. There wasn't that fluidity of everything just in and out. I had more boundaries as a person. I knew a little bit more about who I was. Everything wasn't just outside all over the place.
That was my experience from my side of things. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think riding the bike was one thing, but I think all of the other things as well.
Riding the bike was it was the catalyzing thing, because it was very somatic. It was, when you ride a bike, you actually have to be in your core. You have to be in your body, or you can't balance a bike. And I have some visual memories of you being very challenged in balancing a bike when you were learning it, just like anybody.
Physical balance was a problem, but I also had to really pay attention to crossing the road, and I had to be very much aware of my environment and be aware of everything outside of me. And that was a skill I didn't have, that wasn't well developed at that time. So I had to work hard at that.
This brings a couple things together. So much of what you've described, Julia, along with the bicycle, had a physical component to it. Cooking, writing a check, etc. There's moving across a sidewalk. There's all sorts of things that I think help our minds kind of order and slow down a little bit and find body level of engagement. For a mind that's racing around and not feeling a lot of boundaries, it also lines up with something that the doctor who wrote that review said about the interaction between the work outside in the community and the work that Dr. Green was doing in therapy, which was, of course, more verbal and mental in its work. But so the combination of the whole physical kind of communication and mind, continuum of your life was being attended to and drawn into some kind of more of a synchronized way of working together. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Julia, you were moving more into ordinary life as you're describing. And at some point, there was some parallel process of that happening, moving into more ordinary activity, and I think the cutting starting to diminish. Does that resonate with you all's experience of that period?
Mm-hmm. Do you remember, Julia, when you stopped cutting? Like, when did that leave you? Because I remember at one point later, you were horrified that you could even do that. You said you couldn't even do that now.
You said,
yeah, the cutting stopped at a very specific time. I think all of that coincided in a way, but because I was, I don't know, I'm sure that they were all related, but my work with Dr. Green was going on simultaneously with my work with all of you. And over time, I was able to start talking about what had happened with the whole sexual abuse situation that had happened when I was a child. I hadn't been able to talk about that at all for a very long time. And every time he would bring it up, I would, be cutting myself up to ribbons. And so we stopped talking about it for a long time. And every once in a while, he would kind of dabble with it just to see where things were. But as I think I got stronger, I started to be more able to talk about it. And I'm sure that, looking at it now, just thinking about how we were progressing with other things in my life, what was happening at the same time with Dr. Green, I was stronger and starting to talk more about what had happened. He had this mantra, he would say this over and over and over and over again ad nauseum, that I was the child and he was the adult, and I was the child and he was the adult.
You're talking about the man who abused you.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. and I was a child, and what he did was wrong. And no matter, I always felt guilty. Did I do something to entice him? I mean, I was a little kid, but I felt very guilty. Did I do something that led him on, that made him feel like this is what I wanted, even though I was 12? And so Dr. Green would say that over and over and over again in one way or another, that it didn't matter what I did, that he was an adult and he needed to be a responsible adult, and he wasn't. And over time, I was able to hear that. And I was able to start to accept that on some level, and to believe that, and to stop blaming myself, and to start realizing that I had not done anything wrong and that it wasn't my fault. And once that happened, I stopped cutting. I never cut myself again. And listening to what we're talking about now, I think all those things happened at the same time. I started to develop a sense of being a person again, and being able to get outside into life and be able to function as a person outside of just being in my head wherever I was. I don't feel responsible. I don't feel like I was responsible for that. Mm-hmm. But I did for so many of those years growing up. That destroyed me. And I never told anyone, because I protected him, because it was my fault, not his. I mean, that's the mind of a child, but could be the mind of anybody, an adult. Doesn't matter. It's not, I don't think it's age related necessarily.
Julia, when you came out of that long nightmare of self-blame like that and cutting, so once you were through with the cutting, Julia, did you go back and have any contact with the person who had abused you and any people around that?
At the end, no.
You let that go. Okay.
The one thing that I did do was that and this was done, I don't know if it was the right thing to do or not, but my ex-husband and I decided to tell our children mm-hmm. that had happened. And we told them that I had been sexually abused, because that had affected their lives so dramatically mm-hmm. because of what had happened to me. Mm-hmm. And so we felt that they had a right to know something.
Yeah.
And so we told them they were pretty much grown up. Mm-hmm. At that time, they were grown up. And we told them, not in any detail, but just told them about it.
Was that helpful for you?
I don't know. It was helpful in the sense that I felt terribly guilty about what I had done to my children. And I felt like it was maybe giving them a little bit of an explanation of what had happened. I don't know. I don't know if it was the right thing to do or not. But I felt I owed them something. I didn't want them to think it was anything that they had done, that it was their fault. And I wanted them to have some understanding of what had happened to me, and maybe what had made me go through the things that I had gone through.
Yeah. Once, Julie, your sense of kind of power and coming into your body was happening, I might ask about moving back into the world, the process of moving back into the world, which I think there was the volunteerism you'd mentioned, Julia, but would there be more to talk about there that would be useful, do you think?
Might be important to say that it was not a smooth process. It was an up and down process. Sometimes I would bite off more than I could chew, mm-hmm. and it was not easy all the time. I went back to teaching, and it was way more than I could handle. And I liked teaching. I remember Jack came out with me to the school that I taught at, and I just stayed there for a couple hours, kind of stayed with teachers and sat in her class for a while and just kind of stayed there. And then when I was and then I had to buy a car because I had to get there.
Yeah.
And so that was a big thing, because not only did I have to learn how to drive, but I had to actually buy a car and drive there. It was quite far from where I lived, and that was terrifying. So I had to practice driving and getting there. It was going from Boulder to Denver. So that was a big thing. And then I had to get my job back, because I had disappeared one day. I never showed up for work one day when I had that, when I was driving on the road without, looking, and I ended up in the hospital all those years back. I was working at that same school, and I just never, I never went back there. I don't know what my ex-husband told them, but I had ended up in the hospital, and that was the end of my working there for years and years and years. And so all of those years later, I was trying to get my job back. And so I had to then go back and talk to the director of the school, and that was terrifying. Would he hire me back again? And he was incredibly nice and didn't really ask me about what had happened, and I'm guessing that he knew what had happened. He said, let's give it a try, let's see how it goes, and let's try, for whatever, a month or whatever, and we'll see if things work out. And then I was there for 25 years until I retired. So he was incredibly generous in giving me that opportunity to do that again.
I remember you were very self-critical, like you were really hard on yourself, and moving up through because you teach, remember you taught it kind of the people who were just learning English, right? And then you moved your way up, and that each level you had a lot of self-doubt and self-attack, and you were way harder on yourself than anybody. And then you'd kind of encounter something, and then it would go really well, and people thought really highly of you. And I mean, you did. My memory, of course, it was all based on what you told me about it, was you kind of repeatedly, you're very determined. You repeatedly came up against these big challenges, and you were ready to quit many times, and you just stayed there. You kept going. Had loyal friends among your students and teachers.
Well, I remember thinking, I got through all of these terrible things that had happened to me. And I got through, all of the, cutting and shock treatments. And I got through all of that. I can get through teaching ESL. And, I try to really give myself talking to, it was hard, but I knew that I had gotten through so many things that was so much harder than teaching a grammar class.
That point about being hard and the degree of difficulty and the fear, but going into the fear, I mean, that's so valuable to hear, and what it takes to actually come back and to keep going into territory that you're not familiar with, you're not sure you're going to succeed in it, but you keep trying. We've been talking about your health emerging, and then cutting, stopping, and moving back into life, and rousing your energy to come back. And one of the most basic principles of Windhorse and contemplative psychology altogether is that people are fundamentally sane, fundamentally healthy. And part of our job is to really help to keep looking for ways to have a dialogue and relationship with a person's health, and invite that to be much more part of the relationship, but just activity in life altogether. And I don't know, I'm wondering for all of you, what was your awareness like of Julia's health as it was starting to show itself? What was the process like of of being more in relationship with that part of her, that part of you also, Julia?
For me, one thing I would see is this genuine compassion that you had for my family, especially my son, my partner, and you really cared about what was happening to them, and you would ask me about them. And I felt like I always felt you were a very compassionate person, even in the beginning, even when, I was just getting to know you. But I feel like it came forward more as you started to heal and work through some of the trauma. And I just, yeah, it sticks out in my mind that there was these ways that you would want to know about me and what was happening in my life. And I don't know, there's just that warmth would really come through. And so that's what I remember.
But I agree.
And sense of humor. Oh, sorry. Yeah, and sense of humor. I mean, that was always there too, even in the beginning, but there was more humor that was coming out. And I kept seeing these ways that your mind would bubble up with insight and with wakefulness. And we call them islands of clarity. They just kept accumulating in a way where the aperture on the camera was getting bigger and bigger. So it was more and more available. I felt those insights and that wakefulness.
I totally agree. And there's like a gathering confidence, and really your levels of independence and confidence went beyond where they had ever been in your life, right? That you had to live alone, and you had to your house was a couple thousand square foot house, um, in Boulder, that you had to learn to manage and take care of all this maintenance stuff. I remember once your furnace shut down because the furnace filter was so full of dog hair, it just shut the whole thing down in the middle of the winter. And it was like, yeah, you have to change the furnace filter. And then after that, you change furnace filters. And then eventually you moved to Denver, and really back to, I remember you said that the crickets and the darkness in Boulder always kind of scared you. And then when you moved to Denver, where it was like sirens and
Right.
horns, you were like back in your element. It was like, oh yeah, just managing your life, and like you said, driving to and from work. And I think that this whole period of your life, you've lived more independently than you ever have, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
I'd like to chip in on this a bit because Julia, you and I met, right? I think I was the first person to meet you. I think, yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And we met not for a long time, but maybe the first couple of months or something, we'd get together and talk about how to develop the team. And we'd have breakfast or lunch someplace in Boulder that I used to really enjoy. But I wasn't around to spend a lot of time with you, but I was completely struck in terms of this notion of a person's health and what you feel and what you see with a person's health sometimes. I was immediately struck by how compelling it was to be with you. I really liked being with you. And on an outward level, you weren't necessarily giving a lot that was easy to be with. You could be pretty grumpy, and clearly you weren't having a good time. But I really liked being with you, and I looked forward to being with you. And I was very curious about that. I was really curious about you. And then also, I remember what it was like that I had to be really attentive to how my mind was working with you, because you didn't put up with me kind of lobbing too many inaccurate or just stupid niceties your way. You just weren't tolerating that very much, which I liked a lot. So it made me pay attention to my own mind in a really bright way. And so that was to me another indication. And there's also then later on, I became really aware, for Janneli, you and Jack, of how much kind of devotion they had for you. Just like you guys were really clicked in hard together. The relationships were really powerful. And, I know both of you are very sensitive to your own experience. And so something was going on in the relationships that seemed very compelling for you. So all that kind of stuff was before you came into your body, and it became more of a formed situation as you've been describing. All of that was just raw material of, it felt like the potential, or not the potential, but kind of the raw material of health intermixing with all this other difficulty. And then at some point, Janneli, to your point about islands of clarity, those things started to be more frequent in the environment. And all of a sudden, Julia, your life, I shouldn't say all of a sudden, but over time, your life started to take a form that really had a forward direction.
I think one of the things that happened was Jack and Janneli were very involved with my therapy with Dr. Green. It wasn't a separate kind of entity. It wasn't that I saw Dr. Green, whatever, 3 times a week, and Jack and Janneli outside of that. They often came to my sessions with Dr. Green, and they were very integrated. And that was very, I thought, really important, because it was very important for me to feel like they were integrated, that they all knew each other. And it was, I don't know how to express it, but that we were all working together as a team or a group. And that was a very important thing for me, because I would talk about them all the time, and I would talk about Dr. Green to Jack and Janneli, and I didn't want it to be like strangers. I wanted it to be like one group, like a family. So I think that the fact that they would come, not all the time, but frequently, that really meant a lot to me, that they knew each other. And I remember, I didn't see you a lot after the beginning, but I remember one night I tried to, I was having a very bad time, and I wasn't able to get Jack or Janneli, and so I paged you, Chuck, and you responded, and you came over to my house, and it was in the evening, I don't know, maybe 8 or 9 o'clock, and you spent hours with me, as I recall, and we drove around for a long time and ended up somehow at your office, I think, and then you called Dr. Green, and it was like everybody was all connected. And you said, before I, take you home or whatever was happening, you called Dr. Green and spoke with him. And first of all, that you did that was something I never forgot. And that meant so much to me. And that you included Dr. Green, it just felt very safe for me. I guess that's the word that comes up, is that I felt very safe, that you were all working together, and I felt safe. So that was a very important thing for me. I think it just goes back to the importance to me of relationships, and how important the relationships that we had were. They were critical. They were the most important thing, relationships.
Julia, you just did a tour around some of the ways that the relationships worked on the team. And one of the things that I think is really critical in a team is the coordination of the relationships. And there to be, like, for instance, it wasn't just you meeting with Dr. Green and then you meeting with Janneli and Jack, but you brought them together. And then basically, it's kind of like the way our team meetings work. We have times where people come together sometimes the client's part of that, sometimes they're not, but it's a way for the group to interact and to be synchronized more and together more. But you had a type of an insistence that I think was part of the strength of the whole thing, which was you wanted to be part of that too. You didn't want them just meeting without you. You wanted to actually be part of the whole mix, which I think was part of how I experienced your strength. And I think that really worked well in your team in terms of getting Dr. Green and Janneli and Jack together. So I'm glad you mentioned that. Thank you all so much.
Thank you for listening to Windhorse Journal Entry 77. Stay tuned for next month's episode, part 4 of this 5-part series, to hear the continued conversation about Julia's inspiring story.
Windhorse Journal is a publication of Windhorse Community Services, supporting recovery from mental health challenges at home and in the community since 1981.